They thought she was weak. They thought her silence was an admission of guilt. For 3 days, Grace sat in that cold courtroom, watching her billionaire ex-husband and his ruthless lawyer tear her life apart with lies. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She just watched. Everyone, the jury, the gallery, even her own counsel, thought it was over. But they didn't know that Grace wasn't silent because she was afraid. She was silent because she was waiting for the one specific question that would bring the entire empire crashing down. When Judge Holloway finally asked it, the answer didn't just end a marriage. It destroyed a legacy. You won't believe what she was holding back. The mahogany doors of courtroom 4B in the Superior Court of Seattle felt heavy, not just with wood and brass, but with the suffocating weight of inevitable defeat. The air conditioner hummed a low, monotonous drone that seemed to vibrate against the tension in the room. Howard Archibald adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, a subtle smirk playing on his lips. He didn't look like a man fighting for his assets. He looked like a man who had already bought the victory and was just waiting for the receipt. At 42, Howard was the golden boy of the tech pharmaceutical industry, a man whose smile had graced the cover of Forbes and whose handshake was rumored to be worth millions. Sitting beside him was his attorney, Arthur Danton, a man known in legal circles as the Butcher. Danton didn't just win cases, he eviscerated the opposition until there was nothing left but dust and regret. And on the bench behind them sat Vanessa Howard's fiancé, 4 years old, impeccably dressed in a modest cream suit that screamed innocent stepmother, clutching a designer purse with white-knuckled anticipation. On the other side of the aisle sat Grace. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days, her hair pulled back in a severe practical bun. She looked tired, not the frantic, hysterical exhaustion of a woman scorned, but the deep, bone-weary fatigue of someone who had been swimming against a current for too long. Her hands rested folded on the table, still as stone. Mr. Dantour, you may proceed with your closing arguments regarding the custody arrangement, Judge Holloway said, peering over his spectacles. The judge was a stern man, nearing 70, who had zero patience for theatrics, yet his courtroom had become a theater of cruelty for the past week. Danton stood up, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. Thank you, Your Honor. The facts here are indisputable. My client, Mr. Archibald, provides a stable, affluent, and intellectually stimulating environment for his children. He has the resources, the time, and the dedication. Danton walked slowly toward the jury box, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The respondent, on the other hand, Grace, while we sympathize with her current financial struggles brought on, I might add, by her own lack of ambition and questionable investments, we cannot ignore the instability, the emotional volatility. Howard nodded solemnly, looking down at the table as if pained by the truth. It was a perfect performance. We have heard testimony from the nannies, Danton continued, gesturing vaguely. We have heard from the house staff. Mrs. Archibald, excuse me, Ms. Corey has been described as distant, distracted, perhaps even negligent. Is this the environment for two young children? A small apartment in a questionable district with a mother who refuses to move on? Grace didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead at the great seal of the state of Washington hanging above the judge's head. In the gallery, whispers rippled through the onlookers. The press was there, hungry for the fall of a socialite. They had already written the headlines. Archibald victory. Inevitable sad end for the quiet wife. She hasn't said a word, Vanessa whispered to her friend in the second row, loud enough for the back of the room to hear. It's practically an admission. She knows she's unfit. Howard leaned over to Danton as the lawyer returned to the table. Wrap it up. I have a board meeting at 4. It's already done, Howard, Danton murmured, shuffling his papers. Look at her. She's broken. But Grace wasn't broken. She was counting. The afternoon session dragged on. Grace's lawyer, a court-appointed public defender named Sarah Jenkins, looked out of her depth. Sarah was young, earnest, and completely overwhelmed by the mountain of fabricated evidence Danto had dumped on her desk 3 days prior. Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly as she stood up. My client loves her children. The accusations of negligence are based entirely on the testimony of staff currently on Mr. Archibald's payroll. That is a clear conflict of interest. Objection, Danton barked, not even bothering to stand up fully. Relevance. The witnesses were under oath, sustained. Judge Holloway sighed, rubbing his temples. Miss Jenkins, unless you have concrete evidence refuting the household staff's claims, move on. Sarah looked down at Grace, desperation in her eyes. Grace, you have to give me something. You told me you had a plan. We're losing everything here. The alimony, the house, the kids. He's destroying you. Grace turned her head slowly. Her eyes were a striking, piercing green. And for the first time in days, they held a spark. Not yet, Sarah. Wait for the finances. The finances? Sarah hissed. We've gone over the finances. He's hidden it all in shell companies. We can't prove it without a forensic accountant. And the judge denied our request for more time. Just wait, Grace said softly. The focus of the trial shifted to the division of assets. This was Howard's playground. He had built an empire, and he had ensured that on paper he was nearly destitute. Howard took the stand. He looked the picture of humble success. Mr. Archibald, Danton asked smoothly, can you explain to the court the current state of your liquid assets? Howard sighed, a tragic expression on his face. It's been a hard year for the market. The pharmaceutical sector took a hit. Most of my wealth is tied up in stock that I legally cannot sell for another 5 years. My liquid cash, it's minimal. Barely enough to cover the legal fees and the maintenance of the properties. I've offered Grace a generous settlement of $5,000 a month, which I think is more than fair considering the company's fragility. $5,000 a month? It was an insult. It wouldn't even cover rent in the school district where their children attended. And what of the offshore accounts Ms. Corey alluded to in her initial filing? Danton asked, setting up the spike. Howard laughed a short, incredulous sound. Fiction, pure fantasy. I am an American businessman. I pay my taxes. I keep my money where I can see it. Grace has always had a vivid imagination. I think she's confusing my business trips to the Caymans with banking trips. I went there to scout locations for a retreat center. Nothing more. Judge Holloway nodded, taking notes. He looked at Grace. She was staring at Howard. Her expression was unreadable, but her fingers were tapping a rhythm on the table. Tap, tap, tap. Do you wish to cross-examine Ms. Jenkins, the judge asked. Sarah stood up, looking at her notes. She opened her mouth, but Grace's hand shot out, gripping Sarah's wrist. No, Grace said, her voice clear and startlingly loud in the quiet room. Judge Holloway frowned. Mr. Corey, you are speaking out of turn, but are you instructing your counsel to decline cross-examination? I am, Grace said. She stood up. She wasn't tall, but in that moment, she seemed to loom over the defense table. Actually, Your Honor, I would like to speak for myself now. Danton chuckled. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. She has counsel. I have the right to address the court regarding the welfare of my children and the validity of these financial claims. Grace said, her voice steady, and I believe Mr. Archibald has forgotten one very small, very important detail about our marriage. Howard rolled his eyes. Here we go. The hysterics. Judge Holloway looked intrigued. He was bored of Danton's slick maneuvering. He wanted to see what the quiet woman in gray had to say. Very well, but tread carefully, Miss Corey. This is a court of law, not a therapy session. What is this detail? Grace walked around the table. She didn't walk toward the witness stand. She walked toward the center of the room, directly in front of the judge, turning her back on Howard. The detail, Grace said, is that before I was a housewife and before I was a mother, Mr. Archibald seems to have forgotten what I did for a living. Howard frowned. He actually had to think about it. He had met Grace at a charity gala 10 years ago. She was volunteering. He assumed she came from old money or was just a social climber. He never really asked. I was an archivist. Grace said, for the State Department. Danton scoffed. And this is relevant how you filed papers. Congratulations. An archivist specializing in forensic data recovery and encrypted communications. Grace corrected her voice, dropping an octave, becoming colder. I didn't just file papers. I found things that people tried very hard to delete. The room went silent. Howard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second for 10 years. Grace continued pacing slowly. I played the role Howard wanted to stay on. The quiet wife, the trophy. I let him think I didn't understand how his business worked. I let him think I was too busy with the children to notice when he changed his passwords. I let him think I was stupid. She turned to face Howard. But I have a photographic memory, Howard, and I have a habit of backing up hard drives. Objection, Danton roared, jumping to his feet. This is ambushing. There is no evidence submitted. Actually, Grace interrupted, pulling a small black USB drive from the pocket of her gray dress. I submitted this to the bailiff this morning under seal marked for emergency review regarding perjury. Judge Holloway's eyebrows shot up. He looked at the bailiff, who nodded and handed a manila envelope to the bench. You stayed quiet, Judge Holloway noted, opening the envelope. You let him lie under oath. I needed him to confirm it, Grace said. I needed him to state on the record under penalty of perjury that the Cayman accounts didn't exist, because if I had shown this earlier, he would have settled. He would have spun it. But now he has committed a felony in front of you. Howard's face went pale. He leaned toward Danton. What is on that drive? I don't know, Danton hissed, sweat beading on his forehead. You told me she was a nobody. Judge Holloway plugged the drive into his laptop. The courtroom waited. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. The judge clicked a few files. His eyes widened. He adjusted his glasses. He scrolled and scrolled. He looked up, his face thunderous. Miss Archibald, the judge said, his voice dangerously low, according to these bank statements, which seem to be authenticated by the bank's own digital signature keys, you have $75 million sitting in an account in the name of Vanessa Properties, LLC. The gallery gasped. All eyes turned to Vanessa. She shrieked, dropping her designer bag. I didn't know. He just asked me to sign some papers. Sit down, Danton snapped at her. But that's not the question that matters, Grace said, cutting through the chaos. The money is just money. You can sanction him for that. But there is something else on that drive, Your Honor. Folder 3, the audio files. Howard stood up. Stop this. This is a legal recording. Spousal privilege, not in a one-party consent state. When the recording captures the commission of a crime involving a minor, Grace said calmly. Judge Holloway held up a hand, silencing Howard. Mr. Archibald, sit down or I will have you shackled. Miss Corey, what is the unexpected question you mentioned in your filing? Grace took a deep breath. This was it, the moment she had waited 3 hellish days for. Ask him, Grace said, pointing a shaking finger at her ex-husband. Ask him where he was on the night of October the 14th, the night our son Leo ended up in the emergency room with a broken arm. Howard froze. He looked like a deer in headlights. The arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. October 14th, Judge Holloway asked, looking at the timeline. The report says the child fell down the stairs while under the care of the nanny. Ask him, Grace repeated. Judge Holloway looked at Howard. Mr. Archibald, where were you on the night of October 14th? Howard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Danton. Danton looked away. I was at a gala, the Metef charity dinner. Howard stammered. There are photos. Grace shook her head. Play the file, Your Honor. File named October 14th, baby monitor. Judge Holloway clicked the file. The sound of static filled the courtroom. Then a door slamming. Then Howard's voice. Not the smooth public voice, but a slurred, angry growl. I told you to get out of my way, you little brat. A child's cry. Leo, Daddy, no, stop. A loud thud. A sickening crack. Silence. Then Vanessa's voice on the recording. Howard. Oh my God. You pushed him. He's not moving. Howard, we have to call 911. Howard's voice again. Cold and sober. No, call the nanny. Tell her if she doesn't say he fell, she'll never work in this town again. Fix this, Vanessa. I'm going to the gala. The recording ended. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was deafening. It was the sound of a life ending. Vanessa was sobbing into her hands. Howard was gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white. Judge Holloway slowly closed the laptop. He took off his glasses. He looked at Howard with a look of pure disgust that transcended his judicial role. Mr. Archibald, the judge said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. I have heard enough. The silence that had gripped the courtroom shattered like a glass pane dropped from a skyscraper. This is a fabrication. Howard Archibald screamed, his face a mask of contorted rage. He lunged toward the defense table, sweeping a stack of files onto the floor. She manipulated the audio that his AI generated. I demand a forensic analysis. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel down, the sound cracking through the air like a gunshot. Bang, bang, bang. Sit down, Mr. Archibald, the judge roared, his voice projecting with a terrifying authority that made the gallery flinch. You are in a court of law, not a boardroom where you can bully your way into submission. Arthur Dan, the butcher, looked as though he had swallowed a live coal. He was a man who prided himself on reading the room, on knowing when to push and when to fold. But this was a nuclear detonation. He physically recoiled from his client, taking a distinct step to the left. Your Honor, Danton stammered. His usual oil-slick confidence evaporated. I must request a recess. I need to confer with my client regarding these new. There will be no recess. Judge Holloway cut him off, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. He looked down at the laptop, then back at the trembling Vanessa, and finally at Howard. The court is in possession of evidence suggesting the commission of a violent felony against a minor, as well as perjury committed in my presence regarding financial assets. Bailiff, two uniformed officers stepped forward from the back of the room. The jingle of heavy keys cutting through the murmurs of the press. Howard's eyes went wide. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to fix it. He looked at Vanessa, but she was curled in on herself, weeping silently, mascara running down her pristine cream suit. He looked at Danton, but the lawyer was already packing his briefcase, his eyes fixed studiously on the floor. Finally, Howard looked at Grace. She hadn't moved. She stood in the center of the aisle, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was simply watching him with a detached, clinical curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. It was that look, that utter lack of fear, that terrified him more than the judge. Grace, Howard gasped, his voice cracking. Grace, tell them it's a misunderstanding. Think about the company. Think about the share price. If I'm arrested, everything collapses. The children's inheritance. The children are safe, Grace said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. That is the only inheritance that matters. The baifs reached him. One of them, a burly man named Officer Miller, took Howard's arm. Howard Archibald, place your hands behind your back. Don't touch me, Howard snarled, trying to yank his arm away. Do you know who I am? I know the governor. I will have your badge. Resisting arrest isn't going to help your case, son, Judge Holloway observed dryly. Add a contempt charge to the docket. The click of the handcuffs was metallic and final. It was a sound Howard had never expected to hear in relation to his own wrists. He was shoved forward, stumbling slightly, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing against the linoleum. As he was marched past Grace, he leaned in his breath, hot and frantic. You think you've won? He hissed, spittle flying. I have lawyers you can't even dream of. I'll bury you. I'll make sure you never see a dime. I'll kill you, Grace. The threat hung in the air. Judge Holloway's face went stone cold. Let the record show the respondent just issued a death threat against the petitioner in open court. Bail is denied. Remand to custody immediately. Danton closed his eyes and sighed. He knew the retainer fee he had charged wouldn't cover this mess. As the heavy side doors swallowed Howard and the officers, the courtroom erupted. Reporters were shouting questions, typing furiously on phones. Flashbulbs from the hallway popped through the glass panes. Miss Corey, Judge Holloway, said, his voice softening as he turned to Grace. Regarding the custody petition, granted sole legal and physical custody to the mother. Mr. Archibald's visitation rights are suspended pending a criminal investigation and a psychiatric evaluation. And regarding the assets, the judge tapped the USB drive. I am freezing all accounts associated with Mr. Archibald and Vanessa Properties, LLC, effective immediately. Ms. Jenkins, I suggest you file a motion for immediate spousal support drawn from these seized funds. I'll sign it before I leave for lunch. Sarah Jenkins. Grace's young lawyer looked like she had just won the lottery. She was shaking. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you. Grace nodded her thanks to the judge. She turned and walked back to her table, picking up her worn purse. She didn't look at the press. She didn't look at Vanessa, who was now being questioned by a marshal. She walked down the center aisle, her head held high. As she pushed open the courtroom doors, The wall of noise from the hallway hit her. Cameras, microphones, shouting faces. Grace. Grace, is it true he hit the boy? Mrs. Archibald, how much money is in the offshore account? Did you know about the mistress? Grace stopped. She put on a pair of oversized sunglasses shielding her eyes. She looked at the camera of the largest network present, CNN. My name, she said, her voice calm and steady, is Grace Corey, and I have no comment. The evidence speaks for itself. She walked through the crowd, parting them like the sea. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the storm. It took 48 hours for Howard Archibald's high-priced legal team to find a loophole. While bail had been denied initially a frantic appeal to a higher court, greased by political favors and a claim of health concerns regarding Howard's heart condition, a condition he mysteriously developed the moment he stepped into a holding cell, got him released on house arrest. The bond was set at $10 million. He paid it within the hour, liquidating a secret crypto wallet that Grace hadn't included in the first data dump. Howard returned to his penthouse at the Obsidian Tower in downtown Seattle on a rainy Thursday evening. The ride home in the black SUV was silent. His driver, usually chatty, didn't make eye contact in the rearview mirror. Howard sat in the back, nursing a glass of scotch he had poured from the car's bar. His hands were shaking. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was furious, a cold, calculating fury that sharpened his mind. She embarrassed me, he thought, watching the city lights blur past. She humiliated me in front of Holloway, in front of the press. He checked his phone. The stock for Archibald Pharmaceuticals had tanked 18% in 2 days. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting for Friday morning. He had to get ahead of this. He had to spin the narrative. The car pulled up to the private entrance. He swept inside, ignoring the doorman, and took the elevator to the 50th floor. The penthouse was dark. He frowned. Usually the lights were on the ambiance set. Vanessa, he called out, his voice echoing in the vast modern foyer. No answer. He walked into the living room, tossing his keys on the marble island. Vanessa, I told you to have dinner ready. I've been eating prison slop for 2 days. Still silence. He walked up the floating staircase to the master bedroom. The door was open. He stepped inside and froze. The room was stripped. The closet doors were flung wide open, the hangers bare. The jewelry box on the vanity was gone. The safe in the wall was open and empty. On the bed, there was a single piece of paper. Howard walked over and picked it up. It was a note written in Vanessa's looping, childish handwriting. Howard, I saw the news. They're saying you might get 10 years for child abuse. I can't be a prison wife. It's not part of my brand. Also, the feds came by. They asked about the LLC. I told them everything, Howard. I told them you made me sign the papers. I told them about the accounts in Zurich, too. I made a deal for immunity. Don't look for me. I'm in Paris. V. Howard crumpled the note in his fist and screamed a guttural sound of pure rage. He threw a crystal lamp across the room, shattering it against the wall. Traitor, he howled. Useless gold-digging traitor. He paced the room, his breathing ragged. Okay. Vanessa was gone. Good riddance. She was a liability anyway. He still had the company. He still had the core IP. As long as he controlled the patents for Neurovance, the Alzheimer's drug that was set to launch next quarter, he was untouchable. The board wouldn't dare fire him. He was the company. He needed to check the secure servers. He needed to make sure the R&D files were locked down so Grace couldn't get to them. He ran to his home office, booting up his massive desktop computer. He typed in his password, access denied. He frowned. He typed it again. Access denied. What the hell? He pulled out his phone and dialed the IT director, a man named Gary. Gary, why am I locked out of the mainframe? Howard barked. There was a long pause on the other end. Mr. Archibald, oh sir, your credentials have been revoked. Revoked by whom? I am the CEO. By the acting chairwoman, sir. Howard froze. Acting chairwoman. We don't have a chairwoman. We have a chairman, old man Priest. Mr. Priest resigned yesterday, sir, Gary said, his voice trembling. The majority shareholder called for a restructuring. She appointed herself chairwoman this morning. Howard whispered, a cold dread seeping into his bones. Who is she? I I can't see the full name on the file, sir. It just says EK Holdings, EK Grace Corey. Howard dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor. How, how could she be the majority shareholder? He owned 51% of the stock. He had checked the portfolio 1,000 times. Unless he remembered something Grace had said in court, I didn't just file papers. I found things. 10 years ago, when he started the company, he had used seed money from an anonymous angel investor to buy out his early partners. He never knew who the investor was. The deal was brokered through a blind trust in Singapore. He had assumed it was some oil tycoon or a venture capital fund. He scrambled to his filing cabinet, tearing through old papers until he found the original incorporation documents. He flipped to the addendum about the series A Funding Investor, the Chimera Trust. He had never looked into the Chimera Trust. He just cashed the check. He ran back to the computer. He couldn't log into the company server, but he could check public records. He searched the Chimera Trust ownership. The screen loaded. Trustee Grace Corey, beneficiary, the Archibald children. Howard fell back into his leather chair, the air leaving his lungs. She had funded him all those years ago when they were first dating, when he thought she was a broke student. She had the money. No, not money. Information. He remembered now. Her father. Her father hadn't been a nobody. Her father was Alexander Corey, the cryptic mathematician who designed high-frequency trading algorithms for Wall Street in the 90s. He had died mysteriously, leaving no will. Everyone thought he died at broke. Grace had the money all along. She had bought 40% of his company before they were even married, and with the 15% she gained in the divorce settlement appearing imminent. She owned him. She had owned him from the very beginning. The phone on his desk rang. It was the landline. Only a few people had that number. He picked it up slowly. Hello. Hello, Howard. It was her. Her voice was calm, devoid of the fear she used to fake. Grace, he breathed. You were the angel investor. I believed in the science, Howard, she said. I believed Neurovance could save lives. I didn't realize the man running the company was a cancer. You can't do this, he said, trying to find his footing. I built this company. I am the face of Archibald Farmer. Not anymore, Grace said. The board meeting is tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. I suggest you bring a box for your personal effects. Security will escort you out if you linger. I'll fight you, Howard shouted. I'll sue you for fraud. You hid assets. I hid nothing, Grace replied smoothly. The trust was always public record. You were just too arrogant to read the fine print. You were too busy staring at yourself in the mirror to notice who was paying for the frame. I'm coming for you, Grace, he snarled. Come, she said. I'll be waiting in your chair. The line went dead. Friday morning broke with the gray, relentless drizzle that washed over Seattle, turning the glass skyscrapers into weeping monoliths. The headquarters of Archibald Pharmaceuticals was a fortress of steel and glass in the financial district. The boardroom on the 40th floor offered a panoramic view of the Puget Sound, a view intended to intimidate anyone sitting on the opposite side of the massive oak table. At 8:55 a.m., the room was full. The board of directors sat in uneasy silence. There was Jonathan Priest, the former chair, looking pale and defeated. There was Vivian Lee, the representative for the Asian markets, tapping her stylus nervously against her tablet. There was Maxwell Carter, the CFO, who was sweating profusely despite the climate control. They were waiting. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, the double doors swung open. Howard Archibald strode in. He looked impeccable. He had spent 2 hours in grooming. His suit was a sharp navy blue, his tie a power red. He walked with the swagger of a man who refused to believe the sky was falling. Good morning, Howard announced, ignoring the tension. He walked to the head of the table. I trust we are all ready to discuss the strategy for mitigating this recent PR hiccup. He reached for the leather chair at the head of the table. That seat is taken, Howard, a voice said from the corner. Howard spun around. Grace was standing by the window. She wasn't wearing the gray, frumpy dress from the courtroom. She was wearing a tailored black suit that fit her like armor. Her hair was down, cascading in waves over her shoulders. She wore heels that clicked sharply on the hardwood floor as she walked toward him. Grace Howard scoffed. This is a closed meeting. Security. He motioned to the guard by the door. The guard, a man Howard had employed for 5 years, didn't move. He stared straight ahead. Security works for the company, Howard, Grace said, stopping a few feet from him. And as of 800 a.m. this morning, I control 55% of the voting shares. She tossed a thick document onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. What is this? Howard sneered. That wall, Vivian Leigh spoke up, her voice trembling slightly, is the motion for your immediate removal as CEO, citing the moral turpitude clause in your contract. Howard laughed. Moral turpitude? Because of a domestic dispute? Don't make me laugh. I generated $400 million in revenue last year. You also embezzled $12 million. Maxwell Carter, the CFO whispered. He looked at Howard with apologetic eyes. She found it, Howard. She found the routing numbers to the shell companies in Cyprus. She sent the file to all of us this morning. Howard froze. He looked at Maxwell. You ratted me out. I didn't have to, Maxwell said. She had the logs. She had the keystroke data from your laptop. She's had it for 6 months. Howard looked back at Grace. She was standing at the head of the table now, her hand resting on the back of the chair. His chair. You watched me, Howard whispered. All this time you were in my house, sleeping in my bed, and you were spying on me. I was protecting my children's future. Grace corrected him. You were draining the company dry to fund your lifestyle and your mistress. You were jeopardizing the FDA approval of Neurovance by cutting corners on the safety trials to save money. I saw those emails too. The room gasped. Faking safety data was a death sentence for a pharma company. That's a lie, Howard shouted. Is it? Grace pulled a remote from her pocket and pointed it at the wall screen. An email chain appeared. It was from Howard to the head of R&D. Subject: Clinical Trials Phase 3 from P. Archer Old Body. I don't care about the side effects in the test group. Bury the nausea data. We need to launch by Q3 or the stock dips. Fix it. This, Grace said, gesturing to the screen, is why you are being fired. Not because you are a bad husband, not because you are a bad father, although you are both. You are being fired because you are a fraud. She looked at the board. All in favor of the motion to terminate Howard Archerold effectively immediately. Every hand went up. Even Maxwell Carter raised his hand. Howard stared at them. His allies, his sickens. You can't do this, he whispered. I am Archerold Farmer. Not anymore, Grace said. We're rebranding, effective. Monday, the company will be known as Corey Biosciences. She pointed to the door. Get out. Howard stood there shaking. His face turned a violent shade of red. He balled his fists. For a second, he looked like he might strike her, just like he had struck Leo. Don't even think about it, a deep voice rumbled. Howard turned. Standing behind Grace was a man he hadn't noticed. He was tall, wearing a simple suit, but he carried himself with a military bearing. Who the hell are you? Howard spat. My name is Detective Miller, the man said. I'm with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And this? He stepped forward, flashing a badge and pulling out a fresh pair of handcuffs. Is an indictment for securities fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage. Howard looked from the handcuffs to Grace. She was sitting in the chair now. She looked comfortable. She looked powerful. You planned this, Howard choked out. You planned the timing, the court case, the board meeting, the SEC. I told you, Howard, Grace said, opening a file folder on the desk. I'm an archivist. I like things to be organized. She didn't look up as the detective spun Howard around and cuffed him. She didn't watch as he was dragged out of the room, screaming obscenities. She simply picked up a pen. Now, Grace said to the stunned room of executives, let's discuss the cleanup. 3 months had passed since the boardroom coup, but for Howard Archerold, time had become a meaningless loop of gray concrete and fluorescent lights. He was being held at the Federal Detention Center in SeaTac, awaiting trial. The bail for the SEC charges had been set at an astronomical $50 million, a sum he couldn't pay as his assets were frozen and his friends had evaporated like mist in the morning sun. He wore an orange jumpsuit, now a stark contrast to the Italian wool he had favored. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was growing out gray and patchy. He had lost weight. You have a visitor, the guard grunted, banging on the bars. Howard sat up on his cot on a spark of hope ignited in his chest. Danton? No, Dan had quit. Vanessa, Maybe she had come back to recant. A new lawyer. He was shuffled down the hallway, chains rattling around his ankles into the visitation room. He sat behind the thick plexiglass. Grace sat on the other side. She looked radiant. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans, her hair loose. She looked 5 years younger than she had in the courtroom. She didn't look like a CEO or a conqueror. She just looked free. Howard grabbed the receiver phone. "You came," he rasped. "I knew you'd come. You still love me, don't you?" Somewhere deep down. Grace picked up the phone slowly. Her expression was pitying, which hurt Howard more than anger. "I came to bring you these, Howard." She held up a document to the glass. It was a drawing, a crude crayon drawing of a superhero, dog fighting a green monster. "Leo drew it," Grace said. "His therapist said it was a breakthrough. The green monster." "That's you, Howard." Howard flinched. "I'm his father. You can't turn him against me." "I didn't have to," Grace said calmly. "You did that when you broke his arm, because you were late for a party. You did that when you screamed at him for existing." "It was an accident," Howard hissed, leaning forward, his breath fogging the glass. "Listen to me, Grace. We can make a deal. I know where the crypto keys are for the other wallet, the one you didn't find. There's 20 million in there. I'll give it to you. Just tell the DA you exaggerated. Tell them I was under stress. Get the charges dropped to misdemeanor." Grace stared at him. "You still don't get him, was it? I don't want your money. I have the company. I have my own money. And most importantly, I have my dignity." "You can't run that company," Howard shouted. "You're an archivist, a librarian. You don't know how to handle the sharks. The company is doing better than ever." Grace said, a small smile playing on her lips. "We released the real safety data for Neurovance. The stock took a hit initially, but then it rebounded when the public realized we were being transparent. We have integrity now, Howard. Something you never bought. Integrity doesn't buy yachts." "No," Grace agreed, "but it buys sleep. I sleep very well at night, Howard. Do you?" Howard slammed the receiver against the metal counter. "Get me out of here. You owe me. I gave you a life. You gave me a cage," Grace corrected. "And I spent 10 years learning how to pick the lock." She stood up. "I won't be visiting again, Howard. The divorce was finalized this morning. You didn't sign the papers, so the judge granted a default judgment. I have full custody. You have no visitation rights. A restraining order is in place for when, if you get out." "Wait," Howard panicked. "Grace, please. I'm scared. The other inmates, they know I was rich. They know about the child abuse charge. They look at me like I'm meat." For a moment, Grace hesitated. She looked at the man she had once promised to love and cherish. She saw the fear in his eyes, the pathetic naked terror of a bully who has lost his stick. "I can't help you with that, Howard," she said softly. "You built this world for yourself. You lied, you cheated, and you hurt the weak. Now you're in a place where the rules are different. Good luck." She hung up the phone. As she walked away, she could hear him screaming her name through the glass, a muffled, desperate sound that faded as the heavy steel door clicked shut behind her. 1 year later, the crystal chandeliers of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel didn't just glow. They seemed to hum with the collective energy of Seattle's elite. It was a stark, glittering contrast to the sterile, gray misery of the courtroom, where Grace Corey had stood exactly 1 year ago. Tonight, the air didn't smell of stale coffee and desperation. It smelled of expensive perfume, aged champagne, and the intoxicating aroma of triumph. The gala for the Corey Foundation for Domestic Recovery was officially the most coveted ticket of the season. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, filled with faces that had once turned away from Grace when she was merely Howard Archibald's quiet wife. Now they craned their necks just to catch a glimpse of her. Grace stood near the velvet-draped entrance, smoothing the fabric of her emerald gown. It was a bold choice, a vibrant living green that stood out against the sea of safe black dresses. She wasn't hiding in the gray anymore. "Mom, are you nervous?" Grace looked down. Leo was tugging at her hand. At 8 years old, he looked dashing in a miniature tuxedo, his bow tie slightly askew. But it wasn't the suit that made Grace's chest tighten with emotion. It was his stance. He stood tall, his eyes once darting and fearful, scanning the room for a father's unpredictable temper. When bright and mischievous, the cast was long gone, and the phantom pains of that terrible October night had faded into a memory he rarely visited. A little bit, Grace admitted, kneeling to straighten his tie. There are a lot of people here. They're nice people, Leo said confidently, scanning the crowd, not like the old ones. And look, Detective Miller is here. He promised to show me his badge again. Grace smiled, watching her son dart off toward the buffet table where the burly SEC detective was awkwardly balancing a plate of Arurvas. Seeing Leo fearless, that was the only victory that truly mattered. The company, the money, the reputation, it was all just insulation to keep that little boy safe. A hush fell over the room as the lights dimmed. A spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the podium. Grace walked up the stairs. The silence that greeted her now wasn't the heavy, judgmental silence of the trial. It was a silence of reverence, of anticipation. She gripped the sides of the podium, taking a moment to look out at the hundreds of faces. She saw Sarah Jenkins, her former public defender turned general counsel, wiping a tear from her eye. She saw the board members of Corey Biosciences, who looked at her now with terrified respect. Thank you all for coming. Grace began, her voice steady and amplified, filling the cavernous room. A year ago, she continued, I sat in a chair, not unlike the ones you are sitting in now, though far less comfortable. I sat there for 3 days and listened to a man tell the world that I was weak. He told the jury and the press that I was silent because I was broken. He said my lack of defense was an admission of guilt. She paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. We live in a world that rewards volume, Grace said, her gaze sweeping across the balcony level. We are taught that the person shouting the loudest is the one in charge. The bullies, the braggarts, the ones who interrupt. We are taught to fear their noise. She leaned in closer to the microphone. But I learned something in that courtroom. I learned that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is the sound of a weapon being loaded. Sometimes silence is the architecture of a trap. I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was waiting. I was listening. I was gathering the truth while he was busy shouting lies. A few people in the front row nodded. The connection was palpable. Tonight, this foundation is a promise, Grace concluded, her voice rising with conviction. A promise to anyone who feels trapped by a loud, powerful voice. We will help you find your own, and we will remind the world that the truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be heard at the right moment. The applause didn't just start, it exploded. It was a thunderous standing ovation that shook the floorboards. Grace didn't shrink from it. She stood there bathing in it, accepting it not for herself, but for the woman she had been, the woman who had almost let herself disappear. An hour later, as the gala transitioned into soft jazz, and mingling Grace found herself cornered near the terrace doors. More, a growly voice rasped, or I suppose I should address you as Madame Chairwoman now. Grace turned to find Judge Holloway leaning on a cane, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. He had retired 6 months ago, his legacy cemented by the high-profile Archibald case. He looked older, softer out of his robes, but his eyes were still sharp as flint. Grace is fine, Judge, she said warmly, offering her hand. I'm glad you came. I wouldn't have missed it, Holloway chuckled. You know, in 40 years on the bench, I've seen every manner of liar, thief, and charlatan. I've seen innocent men look guilty, and guilty men look like saints. But I never saw a takedown quite like yours. He stepped closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. You played a dangerous game, Grace, waiting for me to ask that specific question. What if I hadn't asked about October 14th? What if I had just signed the papers? I knew you wouldn't, Grace said, her expression serious. I did my research on you, Judge, just like I did on Howard. I knew you had a grandson the same age as Leo. I knew you had zero tolerance for bullies. I just needed to provoke Howard enough to make him show you his real face. I needed him to threaten me. I needed him to lose control. You used his arrogance against him, Holloway mused, shaking his head in admiration. Judo using the opponent's weight to throw him. He had the money. He had the power, Grace replied. All I had were the details and the patience. Well, Holloway said, clinking his glass against hers. It worked. I hear our mutual acquaintance is currently working in the laundry unit at SeaTac Federal, making 12 cents an hour folding sheets. I'm told he's adjusting poorly to the lack of room service. It's honest work, Grace said without a trace of bitterness it might be the first honest work Howard has ever done in his life. They shared a laugh, a sound of closure. Go enjoy your party, Grace, Holloway said, gesturing to the room. You earned it. Grace smiled and slipped out through the glass doors onto the balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the Seattle skyline, scrubbed clean and glittering against the dark expanse of the Puget Sound. The air was cold, crisp, and biting a stark difference from the suffocating, recycled air of her old life. She walked to the railing, gripping the cold metal, feeling the wind whip through her hair. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a builder. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She pulled it out. It was a text message from Dr. Aris, the lead researcher she had promoted after firing Howard's cronies. Incoming message, 10:42 p.m. Subject FDA update. Grace, we just got the call. Neurovance has received full approval. The safety data you released saved the application. We start production Monday. This is going to change millions of lives. You did this. Grace stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. Tears pry-cricked at the corners, hot and fast. This was the vindication she hadn't realized she needed. Howard had used the company as a piggy bank. She had turned it back into a beacon of hope. Her father's algorithms, her own meticulous archiving, her years of silence. It had all led to this. She looked down at the city streets below, tiny cars moving like blood through a vein. She thought about the woman she used to be, the invisible archivist hiding in the shadows of a narcissist's ego, terrified to speak, terrified to move. She wasn't that woman anymore. That woman had died in courtroom 4B, so this one could be born. Grace turned back toward the warmth of the ballroom. Through the glass, she saw Leo laughing, showing his drawing to a fascinated Detective Miller. She saw her future, unwritten and wide open. The silence was over. It was time to make some noise. Grace Corey proved that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting threats. It's the one quietly taking notes. She turned her pain into power and her sillins into a strategy that took down a corrupt empire. Her story is a reminder that no matter how trapped you feel, the truth is a weapon that no amount of money can silence forever. What did you think of Grace's master plan? Would you have been able to stay that quiet for that long? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.